be all on my line about nothing. Why won't you go get you $1 or something? $1 or something. $1 or something.
Recording live in the Imagination Creation Films mobile studios, somewhere in the middle of North Carolina, it's the world's greatest photography podcast with your host, Bill Howard.
Thank you, Scott, and this is the world's greatest photography podcast, and I am your host, Bill Howard, and there's a hand right here. You can catch us on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Spreaker, any of your podcast sites, and you can also catch us on YouTube at Conscious Creative Media. That's CRE8IVE. Our guest today is the Mr. Everything for Imagination Creation Films. He is more than a photographer. He is also a cinematographer, a filmmaker. He particularly likes shooting short documentaries, but he likes more getting paid working for other people. Is that a good way to say it? This is our guest, Scott Balkum.
Hi. Yeah, I like getting paid. It's really fun, but mostly I do it for anything that like hits me. If I can connect with it, I want to shoot it. I want to tell that story. I want to be part of that to tell that story.
Well, Scott, we ended segment one with you talking about Windows and Mac, and
yeah, I'm sorry. Do you need another tissue?
I use Windows. I don't know what he's talking about. He just throws these in there. If you're listening to the podcast, I know you're going like, "What's going on?" Anyway. So we were talking about Windows and Windows or Mac, and Scott has moved away from Apple products into the Windows. What I want our viewers to and our listeners to hear and see right now is the system you use when you're shooting. I mean, your main camera is a what?
I shoot with Red currently.
And which model?
I shoot with the Red Dragon X.
Okay. And it shoots up to 6K or 5K?
It's 5K.
5K.
Yeah.
And it holds a lot of information.
That's a lot, yeah.
More than what the typical laptop's going to be able to handle. So tell us a little bit about what this system has to do. Does it have like a great big radiator to keep the core cool?
Well, it's actually one big giant heat sink inside there. No, it's a finely designed instrument. It's rather funny. Linus Tech Tips, for those of you on YouTube, they took one apart to try to water cool it. They wanted to see what they could do, and I do not advise anyone to take a Red apart. It's very scary. They are still going to water cool it, but they have basically resigned to the fact that it is the most efficient way to keep what it's doing as cool as possible in the size that it is. And it's a very small box. It's about the size of one of those cube tissue boxes, the one you were crying into.
An old Brownie camera.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's very small and it's modular, but it shoots RAW. Like your still camera, you might be shooting RAW instead of JPEG. If you are not shooting RAW, you should learn to shoot RAW because it does it. But this is a camera that could shoot 5K RAW at 100 frames a second and at a dynamic range that no stills camera can even do yet. It's phenomenal.
And because of that, the computer that processes this to render the video has to be a monster as well.
It does, and it's actually getting a lot better. The cool thing, so I mean, we can go into a lot of detail if you like on bearing and debearing and compression and such. And Red owns the patent for compressing RAW in a camera, so that when it writes to a disk or an SSD or an SD card, in this case, there are little mini SDs that are stuck in a proprietary cartridge. The amount of data that would be at 100 frames a second. Why did you bring a tuba?
We're sorry. If you're listening on the podcast, we are actually on Blue Ridge Parkway in the mountains of North Carolina. We've been doing a shoot here together, and we have a history together through social media and YouTube. And so we finally got to meet face to face, and that's why he is my first live guest on the show here. So,
and if you're not watching on YouTube, what you just heard, I had challenged Bill while I was talking to ride a unicycle while playing the trombone. So far, he's done okay, but that last little bit went a little out of control, and I do apologize. I don't think he accounted for the fact that when you slide the trombone slide out, it changes your center of balance. He went forward. It would
have been much easier had I actually had a seat on the unicycle. I just had the bar.
That's right. Well, he was locked in tight. It was.
I'm sorry.
You can edit that out if you like. So shooting raw at 100 frames a second. So if you want to go into technical details, Red compresses everything before it hits the card through a process called bearing, and it allows it to be super efficient. However, by doing that, it requires the debearing process to take place on the computer side. And up until very, very recently, it took a lot of horsepower to be able to debear that. They have since gotten with it, and this is just extra technical, but it's fun for a lot of people who are nerds like me. They've since paired up with NVIDIA and have given them the code that they were using for their proprietary processing boards to use the new NVIDIA processors, the RTX and the GTX line, to actually do. And Bill fell off the trombone again.
This is great.
To take the processing and put it on the RTX and GTX processors of their graphics card, which is another reason why Mac is not exactly on my happy list, because I can't do that on Mac. Now I can take my laptop that's 6 cores with an RTX 2070 in there, and I can play back full 8K, 24 frames a second in full resolution. Whereas before, I had to drop it down to like a quarter resolution to be able to do that. So it used to take a monster. Now it takes less of a monster, but since I think bigger is better, I just still keep the monster.
We had talked about doing a skit similar to Between Two Ferns with Zach Galifianakis, and this would be a good place for that skit, because I could say, as my eyes unglaze. But the thing is, there's a lot of technical aspects you have to take into account in cinematography, and most people, going from photography to videography, especially, not cinematography, but photography to videography, they are looking for what focuses well for them. We've already discussed that cinematographers mainly manual focus the majority of the time.
Yes.
And they have, and I think that's what I want to share with the audience here, is the gear that we use for cinematography. You're not using a gimbal with a camera head, and you don't just have a guy standing behind a big camera like you used to see on sets, like TV sets, and they're just videoing with a light maybe. Let's talk about the modular aspect of the Red and all the things that are added on. For instance, he said the Red has so much horsepower. You don't have a card that goes in. You have a heck of a hard drive that SSD drive
That's
that's
true.
on it.
Do you want to grab the Red?
Yeah.
So if you want to do that, so it's the seatbelt is plugged in, so you'll have to undo it, and then don't let it slide all the way back, because you'll have to undo the handle. It goes through the handle.
Okay. All right, go ahead and start talking. I'll pull.
This is a great opportunity for y'all to look at Bill's.
You are listening to the world's greatest photography podcast with your host, Bill Howard.
You're listening to the World's Greatest Photography Podcast, and you can find us on all the podcast sites. Just search World's Greatest Photography Podcast, or you can see us on YouTube at Conscious Creative Media, that's CRE8IVE, as well as my guest here. Search Scott Balkum, because he's got a heck of a channel that's going on. Every Friday he does a live in which you can ask him questions, talk about anything from cinematography to cooking steaks, and he'll answer it for you. Sometimes it might be slightly wrong, but he'll answer it for you. So those watching on YouTube, we've got Scott's Red here. We're going to pull it out, and we're going to talk about the modular aspects of the Red. And just to kind of show you how a one-man band is going to use this for cinematography.
So I mean, this right here is a lens. Everybody knows what a lens is, and it's stuck on the front.
And this is like a Canon DSLR lens.
It's a 70-200 f2.8, the Mark II series. And the modularity of this camera is like the front here. This has the front. You can actually interchange these mounts. So I could stick on Nikon lenses. I could put on PL mount, which is our cinema grade lens mount that we have. It's a very robust. You can put on Leica mounts on here. So there's a lot of different mounts you can put on a Red. Whereas your Canon is a Canon, your Sony is a Sony, an E-mount, all that. So there's flexibility here. There's flexibility in how I can configure this camera. I have a handle on here. This handle actually has a trigger button so I can record. This monitor right here is flexible. I can turn it in all directions. It comes off really easily just with some screws, and then boom, now we have a monitor that's sitting off to the side.
Let me say one thing about this. Unlike with the DSLRs where we often will hook a monitor up via HDMI cable, sometimes even with USB I've seen, this one is a plug and play. When I say plug and play, the monitor plugs into the camera body here.
Yep, that is correct. And then batteries, this thing use an incredible amount of power. These pull about 60 watts when they're full bore recording and everything all rigged up. 60 watts, it would drain a typical large DSLR or mirrorless battery in about 7 minutes. So we use giant batteries.
Similar to Sony.
Well, but not the new A7R Mark III and Mark IV with their new enhanced battery packs and their extended life. So we use V-mount batteries or gold mount 3-stud mount batteries. This is a 180 watt hour battery, which is like, I don't know, that's a big battery. I don't know what the smaller batteries are, but
yeah,
I can run this for about 2 hours with this. Talking about additional modularity, like on the side of the Red here, there's another monitor port. So if I wanted to mount the monitor onto the side, I could just plug it in right here and screw it down. And that is for if you're shooting like up and you're down and you need to be able to see this way, now you can have the monitor right on your side. So there's a lot of modularity there. And then I could add on additional modules onto the back to do additional things. On the side over here, we were talking about media. Media right here, this is one of those Red mini mags, and inside here is a SSD, and it allows a very high sustained data rate, very similar to CFast 2 cards now.
And now that card is how many gigs?
This one is a 500 gig card.
Okay.
And then they have them up to 1 terabyte.
Now, as just a question, how much does that card cost?
These cards are now much cheaper. At the time, I paid $2,400 a piece for them.
And people were complaining when Nikon went to the XQD cards and they cost $140 for a 32 gig card. Again, we're on the Blue Ridge Parkway in North Carolina.
And Bill is trying to use a bassoon.
If you're listening, I'm sorry. If you're watching, you know this guy's just nuts. Anyway.
Pretty much. And then like other modular, I mean, every side here has a panel we can take off and add something that enhances our feature or our ability. But I run in a very compact package that I want to just be run and gun, as they call it. And
it's a solidly built camera. I mean, there's some heft to it. There's a
heft.
lot of heft to it. It's not made for the scrawny, and for those that don't know, for those that may even be familiar with Scott, you may not realize what size man this man is. He's at what 6'5", and he can carry around the Red. I can get tired with the Red.
I can get tired with the Red too. It can be small and it can be gigantic. Some of the cinema cameras that we rig out, and it'll start with a small body. It may end up being this large. It's gigantic. The lens that we may put on there may weigh 12 pounds. I try not to run 12-pound lenses, but there are times when you must have that kind of lens because it serves your story.
Now, what kind of weight have we got on this right now?
This right now configured, that's about 6 6 pounds.
It's not more than that. It feels rather
6
hefty.
pounds 11 ounces is where I'd put it. Maybe 11 and a half.
Now, modular wise, on the bottom you could also have a shoulder pad.
Sure. Yeah, you could configure it for shoulder mount.
You could do okay.
And that's just adding on different mechanisms to the bottom or support structures. There's rods in the front. So, like if I'm running, this is the 7200. If I'm going to be putting on a matte box on it, I will run rods out of the front here. I'm not sure which camera can see it. I guess yours can.
Yeah.
Rods out of the front to support this, and then I can use like this bright tangerine will mount to the rods and then to the lens and help take the load off of this mount, because you don't want a lot of pressure being put on there.
If we put the 150 to 600 on it, you would want to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I've run the 150 to 600 with a 2X Canon on there and the giant matte box at the end, and I just all rod supported out, and it's fine. Then we also use what's called follow focus, and follow focus is a gear mechanism that we mount to the rods that you turn that will end up turning this. But what it does is allows us the very, very fine movement. So
now, in cinematography and filmmaking, on this follow focus, it's more than, as a photographer, you may look at it and say, well, why can't you just turn the focus ring? The follow focus has either settings or marks you can make. So you preset the scene and you can set, okay, I want to go from here to here, and you mark it on that dial. So you turn the dial instead of trying to necessarily look in the screen.
You're trying not to eyeball it as best as possible. If you've ever heard the term, people say, oh, they missed their mark, or you need to hit your mark. What that is literally a spot that they place on the floor that the actor walks to and stands there, because what we do, if you look at the side of this camera right here, there's a little indicator. This indicator tells you exactly where the sensor is on this camera. And we measure from the sensor with an actual tape measure to that mark. And so we don't judge focus by eye most of the time. Sometimes we have to. I have to when I'm a one-man band. But on set, we are measuring focus, and we're dialing exactly to 2 feet 9 inches. Then we move our Mark II, might be 6 feet 3 inches. Then we might go to Mark III, which might be 1 foot 8 inches.
You are listening to the world's greatest photography podcast with your host, Bill Howard.
Whoa! What was that? Man, it knocked out your camera.
We had a little bit of technical difficulties. If you're listening, this is the world's greatest photography podcast, and I'm your host, Bill Howard. I'm with guest Scott Balkum of Imagination Creation Films. You can catch him on YouTube at YouTube/Scott Balkum. That's Balkum. And Scott, we were talking about the follow focus and catching your mark. So let's continue with that.
And the reason that we do that, again, as we talked about in segment 1, is we use the follow focus. We use focus as a method to enhance a story or to set a mood, to any kind of character that we can add that serves our story. So when we are doing follow focus, we're able to do a very, very hairline change. I can change from focus on my nose to the focus on my eyelashes, because I could turn it just ever so slightly, and that may be mark number 3.
And that could be very important in telling the story of the movie or the film or even the short that you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's somebody comes up and is standing behind them, and they tell them something horrible, and it's scaring the person in front. You may rack focus to the eye and catch that tear as it rolls down her eye.
That's the important stuff you need to know. So anyway, we are the world's greatest photography podcast, and you are listening to Scott Balkum as our guest. And this is the end of segment 2. Segment 3 will be on YouTube on Friday. If you're listening on the podcast, stay tuned. We'll come back in just a second.
Get you a dollar, something. Why you be all on my line about nothing? Why won't you go get you a dollar or something? Something. Dollar, something. Stop it.